Imagine this. She had no seminary diploma on the wall, no publishing contract, no denominational backing. She was a nurse, the kind who emptied bedpans and held hands through the night, and the only credential she carried into the mission field was a quiet, unshakable sense that God had asked her to go. Her name was Beatrice Evelyn Morrow. She was born in 1878 in Guelph, Ontario, the second daughter of a Scottish Presbyterian family who prayed before every meal and twice on Sundays. Her father worked the railway. Her mother kept a garden and a Bible on the kitchen table, both of which she tended with equal care. It was not a dramatic household. No one spoke in tongues at supper. No one expected visions. Faith in the Morrow home was practical. You showed up, you served, you kept your word to God and to your neighbors. Beatrice grew up believing that was enough. She trained as a nurse at the Hamilton General Hospital, graduated in 1901, and spent the first 4 years of her career on a tuberculosis ward, where the mortality rate sat at nearly 40%. She learned early what it meant to sit with someone in the space between this world and whatever comes next. She learned to be steady when others came apart. She learned that the body and the spirit are not as separate as the textbook suggested. But something in her was restless. She had the routine. She had the purpose. She had the deep satisfaction of work that mattered. And still, at the end of long night shifts, she would sit in the break room with a cold cup of tea and feel as though she were standing at a door she could not find. She had been a church-going woman her entire life. She had read her Bible through twice before the age of 20. She prayed, she sang, she served on the ladies' committee and organized the Christmas food drives and visited the shut-ins every second Saturday. And yet, and this is the part she would later say she could not explain, she had the persistent, nagging sense that she was circling something she had never actually entered. In the winter of 1905, a colleague named Helen left a pamphlet on the break room table. It had been printed somewhere in Western Canada, and it described a series of prayer meetings where something unusual had been happening. People falling silent mid-sentence, people weeping without knowing why. A woman who had reportedly begun speaking in a language no one in the room could identify. The pamphlet was badly typeset and slightly water-damaged, and Beatrice almost threw it away. She didn't. She folded it into her apron pocket and carried it home. She read it 3 times that evening. Then she set it face down on her nightstand and did not pick it up again for a week. Not because she dismissed it, because it frightened her in a way she couldn't name. The way a door frightens you when you suspect what might be on the other side. She wrote to the address in the pamphlet. She received a letter back 3 weeks later, signed by a man named Clarence Whitfield, who ran a small interdenominational prayer house in Winnipeg. He told her the meetings were still happening. He told her she was welcome. He told her, and this is the line she would remember for the rest of her life, "We are not advertising what is happening here. We are simply not stopping it." Beatrice had 2 weeks of annual leave saved. She took the train to Winnipeg in March of 1905, traveling alone, which was not a small thing for a woman in her position at that time. She had told no one at her church where she was going. She had told her landlady she was visiting a cousin. She was not the kind of woman who lied, and that small deception cost her something. But she could not bear, not yet, to say out loud what she was looking for, because she wasn't sure she had the language for it. The prayer house was a converted livery stable on a side street off Portage Avenue. It seated perhaps 60 people on mismatched wooden chairs. When Beatrice arrived on a Thursday evening, there were 43 people inside, ranging in age from a girl of about 14 to a man she guessed was pushing 80. They were from different denominations. She could tell from the hymns they chose and the posture they took when they prayed, which varied considerably. There was a Methodist formality in some and a Baptist directness in others, and something she could not categorize at all in a few who simply closed their eyes and became very still. She sat near the back. Nothing happened that first night, or rather, nothing that she could point to and say, "There, that is the thing." There was singing. There was prayer. There was a short teaching from Clarence Whitfield, who turned out to be a mild-mannered man in his 40s with ink stains on his fingers and a habit of pausing mid-sentence to check whether what he had just said was actually true. She respected that. She stayed for the whole evening and walked back to her boarding house in the cold, feeling nothing in particular. She went back the next night, and the night after that. On the fifth evening, a Saturday, the meeting ran longer than usual. It was past 10 o'clock. Several people had left. The remaining group, perhaps 20, had moved into a loose circle, and the singing had slowed to something quiet and unhurried, the kind of singing that is not trying to accomplish anything. Beatrice was sitting with her hands in her lap, not praying exactly, not thinking exactly, in that particular state of alert quiet that nurses learn on overnight shifts when nothing is happening and something might. And then she became aware of a heat, not a fever, not the room, something she could only describe later as a warmth that moved from the center of her chest outward, like dropping something into still water and watching the rings. She did not fall. She did not cry out. She did not speak in any language. She simply sat there while something she had been circling for the better part of her adult life walked through the door she had never been able to find. She would spend years afterward trying to describe it accurately, because accuracy mattered to her. She was a nurse, and a nurse's relationship with language is consequential. She did not want to overstate. She did not want to perform, she said. It was like finding out that a room I had been furnishing all my life was actually inhabited. I had been setting out chairs for a guest who turned out to have been there the whole time. She stayed in Winnipeg for 9 days. When she came back to Hamilton, she told her supervisor she needed to give notice. She had decided to apply to go to China. Now, you have to understand what that sentence meant in 1905. China was not a destination. It was a direction, a permanent one. Missionaries who went to China in that era understood they might not come back. The Boxer Uprising had ended only 4 years earlier. Several missionaries and thousands of Chinese Christians had been killed. The country was politically unstable. The interior regions where the need was greatest and most uncertain were weeks of travel from the coast. You did not go to China for a term. You went because you believed you had been asked to go, and you stayed until you couldn't. The mission board that eventually accepted Beatrice was based in Toronto. Their interview process was extensive. They asked her about her theology, her health, her temperament under pressure. They asked whether she had ever managed difficult interpersonal conflict. She said she had spent 4 years on a tuberculosis ward, and she supposed that answered the question. They approved her application in the autumn of 1905. She sailed from Vancouver in January of 1906. The journey to the Hunan province, where she had been assigned to a small mission hospital, took 11 weeks, including a transfer in Shanghai. By the time she arrived, she had been seasick for 6 of those weeks, had lost 8 pounds, and had read through the Gospel of John 4 times. She was 27 years old. The hospital in Chengde was not what she had imagined, partly because she had tried very hard not to imagine it. It was a 2-story brick building that smelled of camphor and damp wool. It had 12 beds, 2 other Western staff members, a Scottish doctor named Douglas Fenwick, and a Welsh woman named Gwyneth who handled administration, and a rotating cast of local nurses and translators who were, without exception, better at their jobs than Beatrice was at hers, at least in the first months. She spoke no Mandarin. This was a problem she had anticipated and had not, she would later admit, adequately prepared for. She had studied some phrases on the ship. They were insufficient. In her first week, she misunderstood a patient's description of his symptoms so completely that Douglas had to redo the intake assessment from the beginning. She apologized. The patient was gracious. She went to her room that night and sat on the edge of her cot in the dark for a while, because sometimes that is what you do when the gap between who you intended to be and who you currently are is simply very large. But she stayed, and she learned, slowly, then steadily, the way a language actually enters you, through repetition and embarrassment, and small sudden moments of comprehension that feel disproportionately wonderful. By her 2nd year, she could conduct a basic intake assessment on her own. By her 3rd, she was dreaming in Mandarin, which she found disorienting and then decided to take as a sign. The work was consuming. The hospital served a catchment area of several thousand people, many of whom had never seen a Western medical facility. Beatrice became known over time for a particular quality that the local nurses described in terms she would translate roughly as steady in the difficult place. She did not panic. She did not moralize. When women came in late in complicated pregnancies and she did not know whether she could help them, she prayed, practically the way you'd check a supply list, and then she did what she could. In the summer of 1909, a cholera outbreak moved through the region. It came in waves, the way cholera does. First the rumor, then the refugees, then the patients, then more patients than there were beds, then more than there was floor. Beatrice had managed epidemic situations in Canada. Nothing had prepared her for this. The hospital was treating 90 people in a space built for 12. Staff rotated in 6-hour shifts and slept when they could and ate when there was time, which was not often. On the 11th day of the outbreak, Beatrice collapsed in the corridor. It was not dramatic. She simply went down. A nurse who had been on her feet for 16 of the preceding 20 hours, dehydrated, running a temperature herself, her legs deciding before she did that they were finished. Douglas found her on the floor and helped her to a cot in the back storage room, which was the only space available. He told her to stay there. She told him she would. She meant it, mostly. She was sick for 5 days. On the second day, she was certain she was dying, not panicked about it. She had sat with enough dying people to know that panic was not a necessary component, but she had the particular clarity that sometimes comes with high fever, when the noise of ordinary life falls away and you see things in their actual proportion. She was 31 years old. She had been in China for 3 years. She had not been back to Canada. She had not married. She had written letters to her family that she suspected did not fully convey what her life had become. Not because she was concealing anything, but because some experiences resist accurate translation. She thought about the livery stable in Winnipeg. She thought about that warmth. And she prayed, in Mandarin, without deciding to, which surprised her when she noticed it. And what she prayed was something she had never put into words before. She said, "I did not come here because I had something to give. I came because you asked me, and I still don't know if I'm any good at this, but I'm here. I'm still here." She recovered on the 5th day. She was back on the ward by the 6th, still pale, still 10 pounds underweight, steadier somehow than she had been before she got sick. The way a rope is sometimes stronger at this place. The cholera outbreak ended in late August. The hospital returned to its ordinary pace, which was not a restful pace but was at least a comprehensible one. And it was in the weeks after the outbreak, in that strange flat calm that follows a crisis, that the thing happened which none of them could explain. It began with a child. A boy of about 7 was brought in by his grandmother. He had a severe respiratory infection. Both lungs compromised, fever spiking in the nights. The grandmother beside herself, because she had already buried 2 children, and the look on her face was the specific grief of someone running out of capacity to survive more loss. Douglas examined the boy and was honest about his assessment. The lungs were badly damaged. They would do what they could. Beatrice was assigned to his overnight care. She had, by this point, long since stopped trying to explain to herself the relationship between what she did medically and what she did prayerfully. She simply did both. She monitored his temperature and adjusted his positioning and checked his breathing. And, when there was nothing else to check, she prayed. Not loudly, not performatively, in the same quiet register she had learned in the livery stable in Winnipeg. She had no particular expectation. She had no formula. She was simply present in the way she knew how to be. At around 2 in the morning, the boy's breathing changed. Not for the worse. That is what Douglas would struggle to write up afterward. It changed, but in the direction that does not happen in cases like this, not this quickly, not without intervention they had not administered. The rattling that had been present since his admission lessened. His fever, when she checked it an hour later, had dropped to a level that was not dangerous. By morning he was asking for food. Douglas examined him twice. He documented what he found and what he did not find, and in the margin of his notes, which Beatrice saw because he showed her, he wrote one word: inexplicable. The grandmother, when she understood that her grandson was going to survive, turned to Beatrice and said something that the translator rendered, roughly, as, "There is light around your hands when you work." Beatrice did not know what to do with that. She wrote it down in her journal that evening, which is how we know it. She did not tell Douglas. She did not tell the Sessions Board. She was a nurse from Guelph who had grown up in a practical household, and she was deeply wary of anything that sounded like self-congratulation dressed up as testimony. She wrote it down and underlined it, and then wrote underneath it in her small, careful hand, "I do not know what this means. I only know what I saw. But it happened again. Not always. Not predictably." She kept no record of outcomes and would have refused to if asked. But there were moments, not frequently, not on demand, when something in the room shifted in a way that went beyond what she could account for clinically. A woman who had not moved her left hand in 6 weeks after a stroke began moving it during a prayer that no one had asked Beatrice to pray aloud. A man with an infected wound that should have required amputation healed in a timeline that Douglas circled in his notes and said nothing about for 3 days, and then said, "I don't know, Bea. I simply don't know." She stayed in China for 22 years. She came home to Canada twice in that time, once when her father died, once when her own health required attention. Both times she went back, not because she was obligated to. The mission board would have released her. She had more than served her term. She went back because she could not identify anything else she was supposed to be doing. She retired from the field in 1928 at the age of 50 and settled in Hamilton. She was not celebrated. There was no biography written. She spoke occasionally at churches when asked, and when she did, she described her work in practical terms: the training she had done with local nurses, the supply chains, the language acquisition, the specific challenges of cross-cultural medical communication. The interviewers always wanted the stories about what could not be explained. She gave them carefully, reluctantly, with so many qualifications that the dramatic arc tended to flatten out before it arrived. She said once, at a small gathering at a church in Burlington, "People ask me what I think those moments were. I think they were mercy. I don't think they were about me. The hard thing about mercy is that it doesn't leave you with credentials. It leaves you with questions. Every time something happened that I couldn't explain, I walked away asking what I was missing, not what I had." She lived quietly for 15 years after her return. She gardened. She kept a correspondence with former colleagues in Changde that continued until the war made it impossible. She read. She attended a small church near her house. Not the Presbyterian church of her childhood, but an interdenominational congregation in a building that, she said, reminded her slightly of a livery stable. Beatrice Evelyn Morrow died in the spring of 1943, at the age of 65, of a stroke that took her in her sleep. Her obituary in the Hamilton Spectator was 4 sentences long. It listed her training, her years of service, and her surviving relatives. It did not mention the boy whose lungs recovered. It did not mention the grandmother's words, or the margin note in Douglas's medical file, or the quiet room in Winnipeg, where a warmth moved through her chest like rings on still water. Some of the most important things never make the official record. What stays with us when we sit with Beatrice's story is not the moments that couldn't be explained. It's the 22 years that surrounded them. The language learned through embarrassment, the nights on a cot in a cholera outbreak, the prayers in Mandarin that came without deciding to, the steady in the difficult place. The extraordinary did not arrive instead of the ordinary. It arrived inside it. She said once that the thing she had been looking for in that livery stable in 1905 was not an experience. She had thought it was. But what she found over the following decades was that she'd been looking for a presence. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a souvenir and a companion. She finished as she had begun, a nurse from Ontario with a garden and a Bible on the kitchen table who had simply one winter got on a train. The question she left, and it is the question she intended to leave, because she said so in the last interview she ever gave, was not about China or cholera or the things that couldn't be put in the medical notes. It was simpler and harder than that. Where have you been circling? And what would it cost you to stop circling and go in?